This is a special channel, unlike any other channel. We're not a fake channel. When the Bible says things that you are admonished to do is to first get knowledge, but more importantly, get understanding. When you come to this channel, you get some of both. We give you everything you need to know about race matters, from the history in the old days, 460 years ago, up until the present time, where daily events appear in the newspaper and on television. Come here and get it straight. There's no drinking like alcohol with fake fillers in it. You get it straight without the fillers. And but again, I have to tell you, we say nothing that we hopefully would be race-based. We try to simply tell the truth as we know it. So come here to this channel and get the real scoop on the YouTube channel, Connecting the Dots with Dr. Claude Anderson. Now today, we're going to talk about something I think is very important to you, but there's so much to say about it that I'm going to put it into two parts. Let's start off with part one, and I'm going to give you about at least 10 to 20 things that are very important to Black folks to know in solving race matters. These are the devices used to maintain the racial status quo in this country. So let's get about it. Let's start with the first thing. What's the first thing they do to make sure that Black folk stay in an underclass position, just as you were doing slavery and Jim Crow semi-slavery? Give me the number one thing they would do. First thing they would do is this. They always use very broad, ambiguous headings or terms to confuse Black folk, to mislead them, to misdirect them, so they won't know what's going on. Now, this is not an accident. This was first created and used and implemented in 1789, when they were drafting the United States Constitution. And they met up in Philadelphia and said, we're going to craft a constitution, and but what we're going to do is create a new democracy. We're going to attract people from around the world to come here for new opportunities and new freedoms and new rights. But to do that, we got a problem. How we're going to do that at the same time our purpose is in building this country is to use Black people and their labor to do it. If we craft a constitution that says we are the cradle of democracy, wouldn't we be hypocritical if we say we're going to build a nation with freedom and opportunities for everyone, at the same time we're preparing ourselves to enslave millions of Black folk? And so what they did in the Philadelphia meeting, they closed the doors, pulled the shades, put guards on the doors, and said we got to come up with a scheme on how we're going to best do this. And finally, after a week of talking, discussing, debating the issue about how to craft a constitution, the first constitution of the United States, at the same time use it as a basis for enriching immigrants coming to America, how are they going to do that? They said, here's what we'll do. In the Constitution, we use two kinds of language. We'll have some terms, broad terms we use that specify and particular to whites. We use other terms that will be specifically designed to identify Blacks or the Black slaves. That's what into the Constitution. And then if you read the Constitution, most people don't understand that ambiguous language and broad terms and how they're being used to maintain race matters. That's the first device they use. So what they would say in the Constitution, it says things like this: we the people. When they talk about we the people in the Constitution, that signifies it's for white people. When they say all the people, they're talking about white people. When they say American citizens, they're talking about whites. When they say all people got a God-given right, they're talking about whites. And when they get to Black folk, they have different language. And how was the language spelled out? They use very broad and ambiguous terms like this. When they say, well, let's talk about Black folk, what we say is that those who are indebted, those who are in bondage, those who are property, those who are 3/5 of a human being, those who are non-citizens, that specific kind of property, and those who are equal to a field animal, and those who are 3/5, as I said, those individuals they're talking about are Black people. They're slaves, but it's so smoothly put into the Constitution that most people don't pick it up. And that's why in our civil rights movement in the 1960s, and I heard Blacks out saying, we got our constitutional rights, and we are here to ask this country to deliver on those rights that were spelled out in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution didn't spell out any rights for Black folk. It was strictly and solely for whites. And but I want you to understand that those broad ambiguous terms were put into the first Constitution, and they did the same thing when they wrote the second Constitution. Now, the second Constitution came out of the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which says a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And but they used that language again when they wrote the second Constitution in 1861, because to pick up where the Dred Scott decision left off. When slavery had ended, you had a few very liberal white congressmen or radical white Republicans who says, we got to do something for black folk. And so we're going to write a second part of that Constitution, because the first Constitution was covered by Amendments 1 through 12. Let's write an additional Constitution that would, let's call it 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and civil rights laws. They wrote those specifically and solely for black folk. But in doing that, they tried their best to try to broaden those terms, analyze those broad terms that were in the first Constitution and be more specific. And they put some of them in that 13th, and 14th, and 15th Amendment. And they did still use a few broad terms because the radical, non-radical Republicans were opposed to them trying to free black folk, because you see the South needed black folks again to re-enslave them in the South under peonage and Jim Crow segregation. But they wrote the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the civil rights laws using those sort of semi-broad terms. But then later on, the Supreme Court then justified making those things even broaden them even more by saying, yes, those amendments is in there, but don't worry about it. It's for everybody. And the rule in politics is anything that's for everybody is not for anybody. So whenever you hear anybody in politics and economics in our race-based society using very broad, ambiguous terms like minorities, poor folk, people of color, multicultural, diversity, they are using terms to make sure that nothing happens specifically and solely for black folk. They use those terms to keep black folk down and to keep them out. So anytime any politician in economic programs or policies or in political policies use those very broad, ambiguous terms without being specific about correcting the dilemmas of black folk in America, you're being sandbagged. And you tell them, no, we're not going for that. Anything that's coming down the road for black folk must be very specific. Do not let them use the old game that they used in the Philadelphia Convention by using these very broad, ambiguous terms. You say it's like a fish. You fillet it, open it up, and say, what's inside of minorities? What is a minority? Open it up, let's see what's inside of it. Or what's in people? How can black folk be people of color? Make them be specific. And don't accept those very broad, ambiguous terms. That's the first device they use to make sure nothing changed for black folk in the country and stay just as it was in slavery and in Jim Crow semi-slavery. What's the second thing they use to maintain the status quo in black? The second term, they use this whole myth about a colorblind society. There is no such thing as a colorblind society. That term was never used until about 1896 in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision with the United States Supreme Court. And they used it. That was the first time that word people of color was used, or being colorblind. And so they tried to use that to try to justify, again, not doing anything specifically for black folk. But one of the members of the Supreme Court, Justice Harum, says that this nation should be a colorblind society. And but that was just a hypothetical situation he was proposing. Everybody knew that this country was always very color specific, always color specific. They knew exactly who they were enslaving. They knew what color they were when they enslaved them. They knew they were blacks, but somehow they convinced black folk to say, be colorblind, pretend that you can't see color. And that way you'll never solve the problems, because they knew what color they used to enslave you. They got to know what color to use and pick and choose and coming out. But black folk go for it. So consequently, that is a device that's regularly used in all levels of media to keep black folk in the status quo position of being an underclass. Another third thing they use is they try to also capture and push back, take away your black leadership. In America right now in 2019, we have absolutely no black leadership of any substance. We had a few doing history, starting off initially. We had a few activists way back in the early 1800s and a few in the 1700s, but they were just activists. There wasn't that many of them. In the 1800s, we got a few black, visible blacks, supposed to be black leaders. When about 1818, 1890s, when the evangelical movement went through this country in religion, whites said, well, we have a few blacks ministers. We'll choose them, let them be black leaders, and let them go to church. but also when they go to church and those black ministers start talking or preaching, we got to make sure a white person is present, make sure he doesn't do anything that's misleading to those black folk, but they trying to direct them out of slavery or being free. And so those ministers came into effect starting about 1819, but their primary purpose was to mislead and contain black folk and to preach black folk about pie in the sky after death, and to be good, hard-working slaves, and to not expect anything on this earth, wait until death and get it then. And so those black ministers were leaders, even though they didn't have any education, they didn't understand race matters. But they were still black leaders up from about 1818 up to about after the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, when blacks got the right to vote, then and they could vote a few black officials in. They voted in about 16 blacks in the Congress in the Congress. And secondly, any blacks that got appointed in positions like sheriffs or working for the post office, they became black leaders in the community. And so we had a new kind of black leadership then. This kind of public leadership on the public payrolls and public eyes, they sort of minimized the role of the black ministers and became leaders. But that went on for a while. But then whites started pushing back, saying, if we can't control blacks with the leadership we appoint for them, the leadership we allow to be elected or appointed to a public office, we'll start eliminating blacks. And that's why blacks that tried to be leaders, they were always eliminated. That's why Marcus Garvey got wiped out trying to be a black leader. Later on, you had Malcolm X got wiped out trying to be a black leader. Martin Luther King got assassinated trying to be a black leader. So any black that they could not control, they would wipe him out physically through assassinations or eliminations. And last, but they had another trick, the way they said, let's just simply control them. What we do, we capture any black that has the potential of being a leader. What we do, we co-opt them and offer them meritorious manumission, put them in a major white corporation in a high-level position, or appoint them to Congress with the understanding, as they did in the 1870s, which says if you come to a public office, 3 things you cannot talk about if you're a black elected official or you're holding a public office. You cannot come to this office talking about anything pertaining strictly and solely to black people, point 1. Point 2, you cannot talk about group issues and focus on blacks as a group. And thirdly, you cannot talk about ways and holding white folk accountable for 360 years of slavery in the 1870s, or nowadays in 2019, holding them accountable for reparations. So those are the 3 techniques they use and devices they use to eliminate black leadership and make them disappear. So after the 1960 civil rights movement, black folk got co-opted. The entire cadre of black leadership got co-opted, and they were taught to give up, encouraged to give up, saying, give in to the facts and realities of white racism and join us on a new concept called benign neglect or political correctness, which means take the focus off that you would have been put on black folk, put it on other groups, put it on minorities, those broad terms again, women, gays, transsexuals, anything but black folk. And so consequently, black leadership disappeared. Another technique they use quite frequently is to try to corrupt the Second Amendment and use that against black folk, which says again that gun control. So the Second Amendment went into effect because they were controlling blacks with physically by whites having laws in effect that says basically that only whites can carry weapons and tools or any kind of fighting or defensive tactic or instrument. And so starting about 1643, they passed laws saying that black folk are going to be slaves. You cannot have weapons. You cannot have any tools. You cannot have signaling murals. And then again, it was ratified again in about 1672, where it said every colony was passed laws saying that, called the Second Amendment, that would say that every white person, a white male between the ages of 18 and 42, must carry arms at all times. For what reason? To maintain slavery, to keep blacks under control. That was called the Second Amendment of the Constitution. It was designed strictly and solely to maintain slavery and arm all whites, but yet at the same time say that no black can carry an arm or have a weapon at any time to resist being enslaved. That's in the Second Amendment of the Constitution. It's still popular even today. Now that everybody debates this question about gun control, and at the same time they're talking about gun control, you got to understand, out of about 367 million rifles and handguns in America, most 99.5% are owned by whites. Whites own 99.5% of all the weapons. They produce all the weapons. They have all the bullets. They also have all the rifles, gun stores, and rifle and guns, weapons sales in the country. They own all the shooting ranges, and with the few guns, handguns that black folk have, most of these cities are urged to do what? Tell black folk in those cities, go out and turn in your weapons and get a bag of groceries. If you got any guns, turn them in, because you black folk are shooting other blacks, and the way we're going to help you all is to urge you to turn in your guns, and we'll give you a bag of groceries. That goes on quite frequently in major urban areas across America, but they've never done that for whites. When you go into a typical white home in the South, you might find 15 or 20 rifles and 2 or 3 handguns, and but nobody ever put out a program in the rural areas of America and in the white country saying, we'll give you a sack of groceries if you turn in your weapons, and eliminate any opportunities for people to be killed or to kill other people using the weapons or handguns or rifles. That's another way of controlling black folk, an advice that's used to keep them separated and keep them harmless, and that way keep them under control. That device is again called using the 14th Amendment, the Second Amendment of the Constitution to control them by threats that they know that whites are prepared, that in case of a race war, that black folk are totally unarmed and totally ill prepared to defend themselves in a race war in the United States. They know that. That's why black folk will never find gun stores or gun shops in a black neighborhood, and everybody's going to try to strip blacks of their weapons so that they will be totally ill prepared to defend themselves in case of a race riot or a race war. So that technique is another way of maintaining the racial status quo in America. Another technique they use is always fabricate minorities, and so that when any program comes out that could possibly benefit blacks, whether it could have been the New Deal of the 1930s or the Great Society program in the 1960s or any program that comes out, first thing I do is say that the program can't be specifically for black folk. It's got to be for everybody. You said, what's everybody? Well, what we're going to do now is that rather than it used to be just black, whites, let's magnify that so that anybody who's been discriminated against is eligible to receive any benefits that black folk could have received. And so what they do, they fabricate all these minorities. So now everybody can be equal to black folk, not based on racism, but based on another thing they use called discrimination, and somehow make discrimination equal to racism, which there's no way it can be. Discrimination is a natural human process. Anybody can discriminate. Everybody must discriminate to be able to exist and interact with their environment and with the general society. You discriminate in what kind of ice cream you're going to buy, what kind of clothes you're going to buy, what kind of car you want to buy. Everybody discriminates. And yet I see on a regular basis some kind of admonishment in the media saying we got to eradicate all forms of discrimination. That is totally, absolutely insane and impossible. You cannot eradicate discrimination because every human being must be capable of discriminating to make decisions. But they use that technique, and that way black folk get confused because they don't understand what's going on when you equate racism with discrimination. Those two things have nothing in the world to do with each other. But black folk have yet to understand fully what racism is. And in our future conversation, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to go back and give you the history of racism and show you the difference between discrimination and racism. But what people are telling you nowadays is that there's no difference, that discrimination is the same as racism, that bias is the same as racism, that being opposition or not liking somebody is racism. Those things have nothing in the world to do with racism. We're going to talk about it in part 2 on our program. I'm going to have to stop at this point, and this is part 1, but I got a whole bunch of other devices to talk about with you, and we come back next week. Come back and join me on this YouTube, and let's finish up. I probably only got through about 3 or 4 today. I'm going to probably bring up about 19 or 20 things that they're using to make sure that nothing changes for black folk in America. That's why in this country you're in exactly the same position you were in 1861. You are now a permanent underclass. And where you used to be second class citizens, that a massive unending influx of immigrants in this country has pushed you from being a second class citizens down to third class citizens. And in about another 4 or 5 years, Arabs and Middle Eastern are going to get together with Asians, and they're going to push you from being third class citizens down to fourth class citizens. That way you're going to still be in the same construct at the bottom. All these devices can be used to keep you where you are, which is totally dependent on other people, especially the dominant white society, for your daily needs, your daily food and substance. But we're going to talk about that as we move on. But this was part one. We're going to go through part two and maybe even part three to get through all these points I'm going to make about the devices that a company use to make sure black folks stay a subordinated, exploited, dependent group of people in America that anybody can enrich themselves and use them to elevate their race, their culture, their language, and their gender above black folk. I thank you and have a good evening.